My name's Scott Simon. I'm the lead Android developer on the Field Apps team, and I'm going to talk a little bit about data binding and MVVM, although I know the title of the session doesn't really say MVVM, but so I wanted to cover, I wanted to mention Android's ViewModel class, because I think that a lot of times when people think of MVVM, they think of ViewModels, and Google now has this ViewModel class, so I just kind of wanted to talk about that briefly. I wanted to touch on some of the very basics about data binding, and then I wanted to talk and show a little bit about MVVM and kind of specifically on some of the tips on how we're using MVVM for some of our Android apps on the field apps. And what I have is I'm going to basically I wrote a sample app, and I'm kind of just going to go through that app a little bit and just kind of highlight different parts of that app to kind of illustrate some of the different things about data binding in MVVM. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was this class provided by Google called ViewModel, and it's one of their new architecture components, kind of relatively new, I guess. The thing I wanted to point out here, this is a little quote from the online documentation for it, but this ViewModel class is mostly about managing your application or UI related data, usually across like activity or fragment lifecycle events. So it's kind of a way for you to hang on to your data across things like if the device rotates and you have activities getting destroyed or recreated and not having to serialize them and deserialize them and so forth. I personally find the name of this a little odd because they call it ViewModel, but to me, when I think of ViewModel, I think about MVVM. And to me, this class is not really about MVVM, but it is convenient to handle lifecycle data changes. The next thing is, this is like a super overly simplistic slide about MVVM. I don't know if does anybody know MVVM or use it before? Okay, so MVVM is just another software architecture pattern for kind of how to decompose and arrange your classes in your code to kind of separate out the different types of logic you have. It's similar to like model view presenter, model view controller. But basically you have three different categories of classes. You have models, which are simple business type objects, no UI, no UI controls at all. On the other end, you have views, which actually are your views, the UI controls. And then in the middle, you have these view model objects, which they're essentially UI type logic, but there's actually no UI components or views actually in those components. The view models actually know about the models. They're usually composed or have reference to your other model objects. And they don't know about views, and the views kind of don't know about the view models, but that's why I have like a little dash line here. But they are connected through data binding, so that when things happen in the view model, things get propagated to the view and vice versa. But there's no like direct references between the two. So the rest of this I'm going to talk about is I'm just going to walk through the code for this app that I wrote, and I'll just show you this app. This is a super contrived application I wrote, kind of like some sort of a store application that has a list of products per se with like a cart. So for here, I have just a recycler view with a list of products. And when you tap on those products, it'll basically add that product to the cart. You can kind of see the little cart icon here, the number increments every time I add something. I could also filter the list down to reduce the number of items I'm seeing here. But this is all implemented with MVVM, so I'm just going to kind of go step by step through some of these things. Okay, the first thing I want to talk about is the Android's ViewModel component really quick. So this is the main application, or the main activity for our app. It's super simple. It just has a toolbar and a frame layout in it. And the frame layout here is actually empty. There's nothing inside of it. But it's basically just going to be the container for us to put a view model and show a view model inside of that. So All right, so that's just standard activity stuff. So the one thing I have here is I have this method called getActivityState, which I created my own ViewModel class, and I'll kind of clarify this. This is actually Google's ViewModel class, and this is basically just this really simple class that's going to hang on to my application state. So like in this case, we just have a couple of simple model objects. I have a store here, which can actually provide us with a list of products, a cart class, which is going to contain a list of a number of products that we actually want to buy. I have a couple of things down here to hang on to, like the view model that we're currently viewing, but I'll show more about that in a minute. Okay, so the real power of this ViewModel class from Google is that they have this class and functions here, this ViewModel Providers class, where you can request an instance of that class and you specify the class type here. But what this allows you to do is the very first time this gets called, Android is actually going to create a new instance of that object for you and then hand it back. But then what's going to happen is if our device was rotated and this activity got destroyed and then it got created again, it's going to call this code a second time. But the second time this code gets called, it's going to say, oh, I already had created an instance of this, and it'll just hand you back the same instance of that object for you. So it'll only get created once. So what this is going to allow us to do is that, like, as we add items to that cart object, when the device gets rotated and the activity gets destroyed and recreated, it's going to hand out the same cart object to us. So we don't have to do any serialization of our data or anything like that. And so we're kind of going to simplify that part of the code. I just wanted to call it out because, like I said earlier, like that's not really related to MVVM in my opinion. It's kind of more of a Android activity thing. All right, so the first thing I want to show is some basic data binding. So in Android now, traditionally you just declare a layout file for your activity, let's say, and normally the root item for that activity or that layout is usually some sort of a view, like a view group. There's now, with data binding, there's a new element for a layout, actually called layout. And it basically can have two things inside of it. One thing is a data block, and then the second thing is your traditional views that would normally be inside of your layout. What this data block allows us to do is we can actually declare one or more variables inside of this layout. And just like in code, you give the variable a name, and then you specify what type of object you want that variable to be. And in this case, I created a ViewModel class here called Observable Products List ViewModel. If we look at this really quick, you can see it basically has a couple of properties on it. It has a title and a filter text property, which are both strings. And I also have this onClick method here. I'll come back to this in a second, but what declaring a variable inside the layout file here allows us to do is that it means that we can now reference that variable later on inside of our layout. So, for example, here's a text view that we're going to use, which is going to represent the title. And what we can do is we can assign the text attribute of that text view to be bound to the title property of our view model object that we declared above. And this is actually the data binding part of it. So the syntax you use is you use this at, and then you use curly braces, and then you put whatever the variable or the value you want to bind to that inside those curly braces. This is an edit text. So this is where we wanted to like filter the list of products that we have. So we're going to, again, bind the text property of this edit text. We want it to be bound to this filter text property on our view model. Now, the one difference here is that this is actually what's called a two-way binding. And the only difference here is that you use the @ sign with an equals. And what this means is that the two-way binding part of this means whatever values in this property initially is going to get pushed into the view. But the two-way part of it means if the text changes inside of the UI control, it's now also going to push the value back down into my view model object. So anytime it changes in the user interface, it'll update my view model object with that. The last thing I wanted to kind of point out in this example as well is that I also have this image button here, and I can actually bind the OnClick property of this image button. I can actually bind that to invoke a method on my ViewModel object. So I have the curly braces here for the normal data binding, but I actually have like a little lambda here, which is basically just going to invoke this method on my ViewModel object. So that's how you do the data binding inside of the layout file. So now let's look at how I actually get that, inflate that layout. Normally you use a layout inflator and you call inflate and you pass it in the ID of the layout that you want to inflate. But with data bindings, if you have a layout that uses that root layout item, you use this data binding util class to actually do the inflation. And it's very similar to the layout inflator. The difference is that instead of handing you back a view, it hands you back actually an auto-generated class that extends this view data binding class. There's a number of methods on that class, but the first part of that is that there is a property on it called root, which is actually the root view inside that layout. So that's kind of like your traditional, if you had just inflated a plain layout. The other thing that you can do with it, though, is that for each variable that you declared inside of that layout file and that data block, there will actually be a property or a variable on that generated class with that same name. So what I'm doing here is actually, up above here, I'm actually creating a new instance of my ViewModel object. Then I inflate the layout or the binding. And then on the binding, I call this setVariable method where I say, for the ViewModel variable that I declared inside my layout, I want to use this particular instance for that variable. So now what's going to happen is anytime I actually change the properties on this particular ViewModel instance, it'll get bound to the UI controls inside of that layout that I actually inflated. So if I run this really quick, this is a simplified version of that, but it doesn't quite have the recycler view in it yet. But you can see I've gotten this layout, and if you notice up here when I instantiated my ViewModel object, I set the title property here to be this text string products observable, and you can see that gets updated in the title here. One thing to note inside, if I go back to my ViewModel class, if you look at this, my onClick method, you can see I have just a little log statement here, and I'm printing out the current value of the filter text. So if I open the log window, if I click the button, you can see in the log window down here, it's actually telling you what the current value of the filter text is. So as I change the text inside the edit text, you can see it gets updated on my ViewModel object down here, and it's outputting that value there. Another thing that kind of makes this whole data binding thing work is this base class called Base Observable. This is provided by Google as well. It's just it's a class that allows you to register callbacks to receive notifications whenever a particular property is changed. And then if you actually extend this class, it actually provides a method that you can call that actually allows you to effectively raise that event to say, hey, this particular property changed. So if I go back to my ViewModel class, I have my title property here. Basically, I had to override the setter here so that after we assign the new value to the field, I'm actually raising that property changed event to signify that, hey, this title property actually did change. This is what actually lets the data binding stuff actually work, so that if somebody programmatically changed the property on my object, the UI is going to get notified and get updated to reflect the current value. Okay. So that's all well and good. And I apologize, by the way, I'm flying through this because there's a lot to cover, but I have all the code out there for you to look at later, and we can talk. can take questions after. But so we use this MVVM a lot in our apps now, but this type of code gets really tedious to write. So what we've done is we've kind of created a bunch of helper classes to kind of simplify some of this code for us. So where I want to go with this next. All right, so this is effectively the exact same class that I just showed, except the only difference is that instead of inheriting from base observable, we create our own ViewModelBase class. And if I look at this class, this just extends base observable. We also added this property called layout resource ID, which I'll look at in a second. But what this allows us to do is, and I'm kind of going to gloss over this for time constraints, but we wrote another utility class and some extension functions, which is what this ByBindable is. And this is kind of leveraging some stuff in Kotlin called property delegates. But the long and short of this is that this is a super simplified way to encapsulate the boilerplate for raising this notify property change method. So I'm just kind of going to skip that, but it basically means that we could write variable properties here very simply without having to do this notify property change code over and over and over again. Okay. Go back to my activity. Okay, so this is effectively the same code that we saw before. I'm just creating a different ViewModel object now. Another helper that we wrote is we wrote this function called CreateView that simplifies the boilerplate code that I kind of showed previously. So this data binding util inflate method, which inflates our layout for us, sets the ViewModel as the variable into our data binding class and hands back the root view, and then we add the view to a view group. So this, again, is just like utility code that we write all the time. So we just encapsulated it in this simple function to just take any view model, create the view for it, and then drop it into a view group for us. All right, a couple minutes left. The last thing I want to show, which again is even more useful for us, is we kind of took that a step further. So a common thing that we want to do, a common thing we find is we want to nest view models inside of other view models. So think of it as like if you write like reusable controls and you want to drop that control inside of another control. So we have a case here where we actually have a view model and we want to show another view model inside of that view model. So what I did here is that image button I had previously, which represented that cart, I actually encapsulated that into its own view model. So I created this class called tiny cart view model. And this is just a simple view model class that has a layout. If we go look at the layout for this thing, it's really just an image button with a text view. So it's just an image button, and then the text view is the counter above it. So if I go look at this view model basically just extends a property called count, which is represented by the number of items inside of our cart object. So if I go back to my product list view model, I instantiate one of these cart view models and I expose it as a property on myself. And then if I look at the layout file for this, instead of having an image button directly in my layout, I just put a frame layout in here. And I am binding the content of that frame layout to that cart view model property on my ViewModel class. And then the key here is there's a thing in data binding called a binding adapter. And effectively, this is like a top-level function, or like in Java, it's like a static function. And the data binding library is magically able to trace through your code and find this thing. But basically, you give it a name. And I wrote that here. Oops. Actually, this is actually the same function that we saw that I used previously. The only difference here is that I added this binding adapter annotation. And this is kind of what allows the data binding library to find this function and know how to call it. And the way binding adapters work is the first parameter to the function is always going to be the entity that the binding is being applied to. So if we go to our layout, it's being applied to a frame layout. So the first parameter is always going to be the, well, in this case, I made it more generic, so it's any view group. And then the second parameter is actually going to be the value that's going to be bound to this object. So what this does is this is just kind of like a super clean way in my XML layout that I can just bind any view model to just be displayed inside of my other layout. Okay, I have a couple minutes. I know I'm going super fast. Another really common thing that we have is a lot of times we want to show things in a recycler view. We want to show a list of stuff. And so what we've done here is that we basically have, for example, on my class here, I have a property called product ViewModels, which is just a list of some other view models I created. Like I created this product summary view model, which if I go look at the, this row right here is basically my product summary view model. It has the title, a description, and then it has this little add button. So I have a collection of these view models, these other view models that get exposed as a property on here. I won't go into the details on how I created those, but the key point here is that inside my layout I have a recycler view. And what I want to do is I really want to bind this collection of summary view models that I have to just get shown inside of a recycler view. And if you've written recycler views, you know you have to create an adapter and inflate views and bind views and do all this stuff. But what we did is we created another binding adapter function here called recyclerview adapter, and I bind that to this property. So if I go to my adapters and I look at that function, this is just another top-level function. It's being applied to a recycler view, and it takes in a list of view models. And I've annotated it with the binding adapter annotation, given it a name. And all I'm actually doing in this case is I'm creating a new instance of this adapter, recycler view adapter, and I'm assigning it to the recycler view. So all the magic is kind of happening inside of this custom adapter that I wrote, which gets passed in this list of view models. The interesting part here is, so the get item view type for the recycler view adapter, I'm actually using the layout resource ID property that we added to our ViewModelBase class. I'm using that as kind of like the unique identifier for this item, recycler view item. Then inside in the CreateView holder, I'm actually using the data binding library to actually inflate the layout. In this case, the view type actually is the layout ID. And then when the adapter gets told to bind the view holder, I'm basically taking in, I'm getting the view model at that position, and I'm actually calling the set variable method on the view data binding that got inflated, and then passing that view model into that and just doing that. So that winds up being like a super simple way to just, hey, I have this product, or I have my products view model, and then I have a collection of summary view models, and then I can just very simply bind this list of view models to just get dumped into a recycler view, and it saves me having to do all that code. It gets a lot more complicated when you start doing things like you want to add and remove view models, and you want to start doing animations and stuff like that. But so this is kind of like super simplified, but yeah, it just kind of gets the point across. And I think I'm out of time, but I have. So I have the code up in a repo there that I put at the top. And I put a couple other links about the ViewModel, Google's ViewModel and data binding. But I'm going to be at the Field Apps Island the rest of the day and tomorrow. So if you're totally willing to answer any questions you have or talk further about this stuff. I apologize. I know it was like a fire hose of information, but anyway.